If you enjoy heartwarming sci-fi stories about humans and fierce little alien cubs, please subscribe to the channel and join the adventure across the galaxy. Your support helps bring more epic sci-fi stories to life every week. Lieutenant Petra Voss did not mean to start a war. She stood in the narrow supply corridor of Krath Station holding a small stuffed bear with one floppy ear. It was brown. It had a tiny stitched smile. It cost her 4 human credits at a port bazaar on her last shore leave. She had bought it on impulse because it reminded her of the one her grandmother kept on a shelf above the kitchen window. Krath Station was a predator academy. It trained the young of 17 warrior species to become the most feared soldiers in the known galaxy. The stone walls hummed with weapons calibration systems. The floors were scorched from daily combat drills. Every corridor smelled like ozone. Ozone mixed with the musk of 6 dozen apex predator cubs who were being shaped into killing machines before they were old enough to choose their own names. Petra was the only human on the station. She had been assigned as a developmental welfare officer, which was a title that nobody on the station understood because no predator academy had ever had one before. Commander Ketharon of the Vreth species had looked at her assignment papers for a long time when she first arrived. He had looked at her after that. He had the face of a large stone cathedral gargoyle crossed with a deep-sea creature. He did not look impressed. Petra had smiled at him. He had not smiled back. She had decided that would be a project for later. Now she walked down the corridor toward the juvenile dormitory block, holding her small stuffed bear. She had told herself she would put it on her desk. She had told herself that. Then the door to dormitory 7 had slid open before she reached her own quarters. 3 Vreth cubs spilled out of the door like a small avalanche of gray-blue muscle. They were each the size of a large dog, but shaped more like armored wolves, with 4 eyes and retractable claws that ticked against the metal floor when they walked. Their names were Thresh, Kale, Moru. They were the most competitive cubs on the station. They had been competing since before they could walk, which among the Vreth meant they had been competing since about 14 days after hatching. They stopped. All 12 of their combined eyes fixed on the bear. Thresh took one slow step forward. His nostrils were very wide. He was processing something. His tail had gone perfectly still, which among Vreth meant either extreme focus or extreme emotion. Petra held the bear at eye level. She kept her voice soft. She said it was called a teddy bear. She said it was a human comfort object. She said it was soft. Thresh took another step. His paw reached out very slowly. He touched the bear with one claw tip. The bear squeaked. Thresh leaped backward 3 feet. Kale made a sound like a tea kettle. Moro pressed himself flat against the wall, and all 3 of them stared at the bear. Then they stared at Petra. Then Thresh walked back forward with his chest puffed out, showing he had not been afraid at all. He had simply been surprised. There was a difference. He pressed the bear again with his whole paw this time. The bear squeaked again. Thresh made a low vibrating sound deep in his chest that Petra had learned over 6 weeks of dormitory observation was the Vreth equivalent of pure delight. She held the bear out. He took it in both front paws with a gentleness that looked completely impossible from a creature whose species had been described in her briefing documents as capable of tearing through titanium sheeting with their bare claws. He held the bear. He looked at it. He squeaked it himself. Kale lost all composure entirely. He launched himself at Thresh. Thresh turned his whole body away and hunched over the bear. Moru grabbed Thresh from the other side. A second door opened down the corridor. Vreth cubs came out of it. Skathi were tall for their age. They had 6 limbs. Their upper 4 ended in long, delicate fingers. They were considered the most intellectually advanced species on the station. They were the ones who designed the tactical scenarios. They were the ones who already read classified military texts for recreation. They moved like liquid toward the Vreth cubs. One of them saw the bear. Then all 4 of them saw the bear. Then the corridor contained 7 cubs, all moving toward a single stuffed animal that was already pressed between the paws of a Vreth cub who had no intention of releasing it. Petra stood very still in the middle of all of this, with the expression of someone who has just realized that their small personal choice has become a much larger situation. She reached out. She gently took the bear from Thresh. He made a wounded sound. She held the bear up so all 7 cubs could see it clearly. She squeezed it once. 7 sets of alien eyes watched the bear squeak. 7 alien children fell completely silent. In the silence of that corridor, on the most dangerous training station in the sector, a tiny stuffed bear with one floppy ear became the most important object in the known galaxy. Petra looked at all 7 faces. She looked at the bear. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. She told them that there would need to be a system. What happened over the next 72 hours on Krath Station would later be recorded in the official station logs as an unprecedented breakdown of juvenile behavioral protocols. It was described in those logs using very formal language that completely failed to capture what it actually looked like. What it actually looked like was this. Petra set up a sharing schedule on her datapad. She drew it in bright colors because she had learned that color coding worked better than text for multi-species communication. The bear would rotate. Each cub got 30 minutes. The schedule was fair. The schedule was logical. The schedule lasted approximately 4 hours before 3. Scothy cubs, who had not been on the original schedule, heard about the bear from the 4 who had. They arrived at Petra's door in a line. They stood very straight. They stated their case using 17 separate logical arguments for why the rotation was structurally flawed. One of them used a diagram. Petra made the schedule larger. Then a group of Heathkai cubs found out. Heathkai were round. They were the size of large ottomans. They had no visible eyes, but they had sensory frills around their entire bodies that could detect heat, sound, vibration, light pressure. They could feel the bear's texture from across a room. When the first Heathkai cub touched the bear, it went completely motionless for 11 seconds. Then it made a very quiet, low hum. Every other Heathkai cub within 30 meters turned its frills toward that sound. Petra's dormitory door was completely blocked within 6 minutes. She stood in her doorway looking at 8 very round, very still alien children who were all vibrating on a frequency she could not hear but could feel in her back teeth. She added 8 more slots to the schedule. Then the Vreth cubs found out about the expanded schedule. The Vreth position was that the original schedule gave them historical precedence. They had touched the bear first. That meant something in Vreth culture. It meant something significant. Thresh presented this argument by standing in the corridor outside the Scothy block at 3 in the station morning, making a sound like a distant foghorn, until Petra came out in her sleep clothes, holding the bear out to calm him down. He stopped the moment he saw her. He looked at the bear. He looked at her face. He sat down directly on her feet. He was very heavy. She stood there with a Vreth cub on her feet at 3 in the morning on a military station, holding a stuffed bear while the overhead lights cycled through their dim nighttime setting. She looked down at the top of his head. She put her hand on it. He made the deep, vibrating sound. She stood there for a while. That became a scene that a young Scothy cadet on night watch observed from the far end of the corridor. He would describe it in his personal log as the strangest thing he had ever seen on the station. He would also describe it as something he could not stop thinking about. By the end of day 2, the schedule had 41 names on it. By the end of day 3, it had been stolen twice and reconstructed from memory. Petra moved the schedule to the public bulletin display in the main corridor. This was a system used for posting combat rankings. The Heathkai cubs pressed their frills against the display screen to read it. The Vreth cubs memorized it. The Scothy cubs debated its fairness in 3 separate organized sessions. One Scothy cub named Vel, who was the smallest cadet on the entire station by a significant margin, had been scheduled for the final slot of each rotation. He had accepted this. He had not complained. What he had done was arrive at Petra's door exactly 8 minutes before his slot. Every single time and sit outside it in perfect patience, which was so unusual for a Scothy that 2 of his dormitory leaders had independently filed reports. During his slot, Vel did not squeak the bear. He did not test it. He held it in both sets of upper hands, and he pressed his face against the top of its head. He stayed like that for the entire 30 minutes. Petra watched this from her chair with a feeling moving through her chest that she did not have a word for in any of the 17 languages she had studied. When the slot ended, Vel placed the bear carefully on her desk. He stood up. He turned to leave. He turned back. He was 9 inches tall at his tallest. He looked at her with the large, pale eyes that Scothy cubs had before their pupils narrowed into combat focus in adulthood. He said in very careful translated standard that the bear smelled like somewhere safe. Then he walked out. Petra sat in her chair for a long time after that. Outside in the corridor, the next cub was already waiting. The system was working. The system was mostly working. The system was working until the senior cadets found out. Senior cadets on Krath Station were not cubs. They were not small. They were not soft. They were between 3 and 7 years into their combat training. They were large. They were confident. They had spent years being trained to be the most terrifying things in their respective species. The first senior cadet to hear about the bear was a Vreth called Dren, who was Thresh's older sibling by 2 clutches. Dren was enormous by Vreth standards. Dren had 17 combat citations. Dren walked past the public schedule board on the main corridor. Dren stopped. Then Dren looked at the name at the top of the list, who was responsible for the schedule. Dren had heard of Petra Voss, the welfare officer. Dren had opinions about welfare officers that were traditional Vreth opinions, which were that welfare was a concept invented by species who had not yet developed sufficient claws. Dren went to find Thresh. Thresh was in the dormitory common room waiting for his scheduled slot. Dren asked what the schedule was about. Thresh explained. Dren asked what a teddy bear was. Thresh could not explain this adequately in words. Thresh said Dren would have to see it. Dren said that was not happening. Thresh said fine. 2 hours later, Dren was outside Petra's door in the senior cadet way, which was standing at exact military attention and not admitting that there was any other reason to be there. Petra opened the door. She looked up at Dren, who was very large. Dren looked at the bear on Petra's desk over Petra's shoulder. Petra picked the bear up. She held it out. Dren did not take it. Dren stood very still. Petra waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned from the Heathkai cubs that stillness was its own kind of invitation. Dren reached out one massive clawed hand. Dren touched the bear with one finger. The bear squeaked. Something moved across Dren's face very fast. It was there for only a moment. Then it was gone behind 17 combat citations of controlled expression. Dren stepped back. Dren said in a perfectly leveled voice that it was not what was expected. Dren left. Dren came back the next morning with 4 other senior Vreth cadets who all stood in the corridor outside Petra's door at military attention, not admitting anything. Petra made the schedule larger. The senior cadets were put on the schedule. They were very serious about their slots. They did not squeak the bear. They held it with great dignity. They also competed intensely for earlier slots, which was exactly the same as what the cubs did, but performed with considerably more ceremony. Meanwhile, the Heathkai senior cadets arrived as a group of 14. They arrived because one of the junior Heathkai cubs had gone back to the senior dormitory and described the bear to them using full body vibration communication, which among Heathkai was capable of conveying texture, temperature, emotion, memory association in extraordinary detail. 14 large, round Heathkai senior cadets pressed through Petra's door. They filled her entire room. They were touching every surface with their sensory frills, trying to find the thing the young one had described. Petra stood on her bunk because there was nowhere else to stand. She held the bear above her head. 14 sets of frills turned toward it like flowers toward a sun. The bear was passed from frill to frill across the room with a care that was physically breathtaking to watch. Then a Skathi senior cadet named Commander Candidate Revith, who was considered the most tactically brilliant mind of her generation, pushed through the doorway. She stood 6 feet tall on 4 legs with 2 upper arms crossed in the classic Skathi posture of academic assessment. She looked at the room full of Heathkai, looked at Petra on the bunk. She looked at the bear. She said in perfect standard that she did not understand the appeal. She also said this while taking a step closer. Petra stepped down from the bunk. She held the bear out to Revith. Revith did not move. Petra placed the bear on Revith's crossed arms gently. Revith looked down at it. Revith said nothing for 30 seconds. Then Revith said that the construction was interesting. The materials suggested deliberate softness as an intentional design choice. That the expression on its face communicated non-threat through simplified features. That it was a sophisticated emotional tool designed to trigger protective instinct.
Ow.
Revith was saying all of this in a clinical voice while holding the bear progressively closer to her chest. Petra kept her face completely neutral. She was very good at this. Then Vel pushed through the doorway. Vel saw Revith holding the bear. Vel went completely still. Something passed between them that was entirely nonverbal. Revith looked down at Vel. Vel looked up at Revith. Revith slowly held the bear out toward Vel. Vel took it, held it to his chest. Revith watched him do this. Then Revith turned around. Revith walked back out into the corridor. Outside in the corridor, Revith stood against the wall for a long moment. 2 passing cadets looked at her. She stared straight ahead. Her upper hands were still in the position they had been when she was holding the bear. She was not going to mention that to anyone. That was a private thing. Petra appeared in her doorway. She watched Revith for a moment. She said quietly that Revith was welcome back any time. Revith said she had no reason to return. Petra said she knew. Revith came back the next day. She brought a scothy academic text on the psychology of comfort objects. She left it on Petra's desk. She picked up the bear for approximately 90 seconds. She left. This became a pattern. It became a pattern across species. Senior cadets arrived with reasons. They all had reasons. The weapons specialists who needed to assess the structural integrity of the stitching. The tactical officer who was studying human behavioral development objects for a thesis. The combat instructor who was evaluating civilian contraband protocols. They all had reasons. They all held the bear. Krath Station was changing in ways nobody could name. Petra could name it. She had a word for it. The word was the same in every human language. The word was gentleness. It had been here all along underneath the claws. She had just brought something to put it in. Then came the day that changed everything. The day started with Vel refusing to give the bear back. Not in a dramatic way, not with any of the growling or posturing that the Vreth cubs used when their slot ended. Vel simply did not release it when the schedule said he should. Petra knocked on the dormitory door at the end of his slot. She went inside. Vel was sitting in the corner of his bunk with the bear held in both upper sets of hands pressed against his chest. His pale eyes were closed. He was humming very quietly. The hum was so low that Petra felt it more than heard it. This was significant because Scothy cubs did not hum. Humming was a Heathkai behavior. Vel had been spending so much time in the shared schedule sessions that he had absorbed a Heathkai comfort behavior. Petra sat down on the floor next to his bunk. She did not reach for the bear. She did not say anything about the schedule. She said nothing at all for 3 minutes. Then she asked if he was all right. Vel opened his eyes. He looked at her with those pale, wide eyes. He said that his clutch group had been assessed that week. Said the assessment showed that he was the smallest, the slowest, the least combat-ready of all the Scothy cadets. He said the instructors had been very precise about this. Said it in a flat voice, a voice that had already been through the feeling. He said that nobody had asked if he was all right. Petra looked at him for a long time. She said that she was asking now. Something in Vel's face changed. It was small. It was enormous. He held the bear a little tighter. He said that he did not want to be a weapon. He said he wanted to build things. He said he had been building theoretical navigational models in his personal time that his instructors said were too complex to be practical. He said they were practical. It checked 17 times. He was 9 inches tall on a predator station where every wall had scorch marks from combat drills. He was telling a human woman who sat on the floor next to him that he wanted to build navigational models. Petra reached out very slowly. She put one hand over his upper hands where they were wrapped around the bear. She said that building things was not less than fighting things. She said it clearly. She said it like it was a fact she had checked 17 times herself. Vel looked at her hands over the bear. He said that the instructors did not agree. Petra said that the instructors were not her. Vel looked at her for a long time. Then Thresh appeared in the doorway. Thresh had been coming to find Vel to tell him his slot was over. Thresh stood in the doorway. Thresh looked at Vel with the bear. Thresh looked at Petra on the floor. Thresh sat down in the doorway. Just sat down in it like a doorstopper made of apex predator cub. Maru arrived behind him a minute later. Maru sat next to him. Kale arrived. Kale sat on Moro. 3 Heathkai cubs pressed in around the sides of the doorway, unable to fit through because Thresh was blocking it. They vibrated softly. For Scothy cubs arrived from the far corridor and pressed up behind the Heathkai. Nobody said anything. They were all just there, in a doorway, around a 9-inch tall cadet who was holding a stuffed bear in a corner. Petra looked around at all of them. Her throat felt very full. She said very quietly that she thought they should all stay for a while. Nobody argued. They stayed. Thresh fell asleep in the doorway. He was still there 2 hours later when Commander Ketheron came to find Petra because she had missed 2 administrative briefings, and the station calendar was showing her marked as unavailable. Kethron stood at the end of the corridor. He looked at the dormitory door. He looked at the Vreth cub blocking it. He looked at the Heathkai cubs vibrating softly in the gap. He looked at the corridor full of cadets, both junior, senior, large, small, sitting in various states of doze and quiet. He stood very still. Then he walked away. He returned to his command level. He looked out the observation window over the training floors. He stood there for a while. His aide asked if the briefings would be rescheduled. He said yes. His aide asked if the welfare officer required a behavioral assessment. Kethron looked out the window for another moment. He said no. He said the welfare officer was doing precisely what a welfare officer was supposed to do. His aide wrote that down. His aide was not sure what it meant. Kethron was not entirely sure either. He understood it in a way that went past language. The tug-of-war happened on day 11. It happened because the schedule collapsed. It collapsed because Thresh decided that historical precedents entitled him to an extended slot. Dren backed this claim using 17 combat citations and the Vreth principle of seniority by achievement. The Skathi cadets produced a counter-argument in formal writing with 12 supporting citations from Krath Station's own behavioral codes. The Heathkai cadets began a collective low-frequency vibration that translated roughly as deep communal disagreement. Vel was holding the bear when all of this began. He was sitting on the floor of Petra's room, having arrived 20 minutes early, as was his pattern. Petra was at her desk, trying to file 3 weeks of overdue welfare reports. The bear was in Vel's hands. The room gradually filled with representatives from every species as the argument spread from corridor to corridor faster than the ventilation system cycled air. By the time Petra turned around from her desk, there were 43 cadets of 7 species in her room and in the corridor outside it. They were all talking at once in 17 different languages. The translation units were overwhelmed. Nobody was actually listening to anyone. Thresh was on one side of the room. Revith was on the other. Both were making cases for their claim. Both were getting louder. Vel was in the corner holding the bear, looking at all of this with his pale eyes going very wide. Petra stood up. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She stood in the middle of 43 combat-trained alien cadets of up to 700 pounds in body weight. She put 2 fingers in her mouth. She whistled. The sound cut through every translation unit simultaneously, because whistling was a frequency that none of the species present used for communication. Every single cadet went silent. Every eye in the room turned to Petra. She stood very still in the sudden silence. She looked around the room. She said in a calm, clear voice that this was a teddy bear. She said it was 12 inches tall. She said it weighed approximately 4 ounces. She said no being in this room was going to fight over it. She held out her hand to Vel. Vel hesitated. He looked at the bear. He looked at her. He placed the bear carefully in her hand. She held it up. She said that since they had all been unable to agree on a schedule, she was going to propose something different. She said they were going to play a human game. She said it was called a tug-of-war. She said the rules were simple. She said she was going to walk to the main training floor. She said any group who wanted to argue about priority could follow her. She said they would settle it there. Then she walked out of her own room carrying a 4-ounce stuffed bear through a silent corridor of 43 stunned cadets. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the main training level. The doors opened. She walked in. 43 cadets tried to follow her into one elevator. The elevator made a very stressed sound. She took 2 trips. The main training floor of Krath Station was the size of a large aircraft hangar. Its floors were blast-resistant composite. Its walls held weapons racks, impact buffers, scoring systems for 17 different combat disciplines. It was built to simulate battlefield conditions. It had been the site of thousands of combat assessments. Nothing that had ever happened on that floor prepared it for what happened next. Petra walked to the center of it. She set the bear down. She found a length of practice rope from the equipment storage along the wall. She tied one end loosely around the bear's middle with a knot that could be pulled free easily. She held the other end. She looked at the cadets spread across the floor behind her. She looked up at the observation deck above. Kethron was there. 3 other senior commanders were there. 2 admirals who had been visiting for a routine inspection were there. They had come out onto the deck because the training floor activity indicators had lit up unexpectedly. They were looking down at this. They were looking at a human woman standing alone in the center of their combat floor, holding a rope tied to a stuffed animal. Petra spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. She said that a tug-of-war worked like this. She said each group who believed they had strongest claim to the bear would hold part of the rope. She said the group who pulled the bear to their side won the next rotation slot. She said there were rules. No claws. No secondary limbs beyond what your species typically walked on. No translation. No structural damage to the floor. She said those were the rules of the game. She said human games had rules. She said the rules were what made it a game instead of a fight. She looked at Thresh. She looked at Revith. She looked at the Heathkai cluster. She said she was adding one more rule. She said the rule was that Vel would hold the other end of the rope. She looked at Vel. Vel looked at her. He was 9 inches tall. She was handing him the other end of the rope. He walked forward, across that enormous floor. He reached up, took the rope end in both upper hands. He stood there, looked impossibly small. He stood there like he was holding something much more important than a rope, 'cause he was. Thresh watched this. Thresh looked at Vel. Thresh had been competing against every creature on this station for as long as he could remember. Thresh looked at Vel holding that rope. Thresh did something extraordinary. Thresh walked to stand beside Vel, not on the opposing side. Beside him, Dren arrived a moment later. Dren also stood beside Vel. The Heathkai cubs pressed to Vel's side in a warm round cluster. Revith stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to stand behind Vel. She put one large upper hand on his shoulder. He did not look up. He held the rope. On the other side of the floor, the opposing groups that had been assembling slowly looked at each other. They looked at the growing group on Vel's side. They looked at the small figure at the center of it holding a rope. Something was happening. Something that none of the combat assessment metrics on Krath Station had a category for. Petra watched from the side. She had not planned this. She had planned the tug-of-war to settle the scheduling dispute. She had not planned for Thresh to stand next to Vel. She had not planned for 13-9 cadets to spontaneously realign around one small Skathi who wanted to build navigation models. This was what happened when you gave people a game with rules. When you gave them something soft to pull toward. When you stood in the center of a combat floor at 5 feet 4 inches and whistled loud enough to cut through everything. It was not strategy. It was something older than strategy. It was something humans had been doing for a very long time. The rope pulled taut. The groups on the far side had decided to play. They were pulling hard. They were large. They were trained. Vel was pulled forward 2 steps. He did not let go. Thresh grabbed the rope below his hands. Dren grabbed it below Thresh. Revith grabbed it above Vel. The Heathkai flattened themselves against the floor, pressing their full considerable weight backward. The rope held. The teams pulled. The floor vibrated. The commanders on the observation deck above watched in complete silence. One of the visiting admirals was gripping the observation rail. The tug-of-war lasted 9 minutes. It was not the extraordinary part. The extraordinary part was that when it was over, and Vel's side had held their ground through 9 minutes of contest against cadets 3 times their size, the bear sat exactly where Petra had put it in the center of the floor. Neither side had pulled it to their end. The rope had simply held. Nobody had won the scheduled rotation. Nobody had won the bear. What they had done was something that had never happened between rival species groups on Krath Station in its 40-year operational history. They had pulled together, the same direction for the same thing. Even the groups opposing them had been pulling toward the bear, toward the thing that smelled like somewhere safe. Commander Ketheron stood on the observation deck. He did not say anything. One of the visiting admirals said in a very quiet voice that she had never seen anything like it. The other admiral said that she did not have words for what she had just watched. Ketheron said that he did. He said the welfare officer was good at her job. He said it simply. He said it the way Avrith said things they had decided to be completely certain about. Petra walked to the center of the floor. She picked up the bear. She untied the rope. She carried the bear back to where Vel was standing, surrounded by cadets of 6 species, all breathing hard from 9 minutes of contest. She crouched down in front of him. She held the bear out. He looked at it. He looked at her. She said that he had held his end. He said he almost dropped it twice. She said almost did not count. She said almost was just the space between trying. She put the bear in his hands. He held it. He held it the way he always did, pressed to his chest. Around him, 39 cadets of 6 species stood, quietly catching their breath. Some of them had their hands still on each other from the contest. They had not moved apart. The training floor was very still. The overhead lights were bright. The walls smelled like ozone. Above them on the observation deck, a gargoyle cathedral commander was doing the Vreth equivalent of smiling, which involved a very slight widening of the secondary jaw that almost nobody could read but Petra had learned to read in week 3. She stood up. She looked around at the floor full of cadets around Vel. She looked at the bear. She said that she was going to need a bigger schedule. A sound moved through the floor. It was not any one species sound. It was all of them at once. It was something that happened when creatures who had been trained to be separated by competition for their whole lives stood close enough to feel each other breathing. It sounded like something that had been waiting a long time to come out. It sounded like the inside of a room where a grandmother kept a bear on a shelf above the kitchen window. Petra stood in the center of Krath Station's combat floor at 5 feet 4 inches, surrounded by the most dangerous young in the galaxy. She felt completely at home. She had known she would. She had known it since she bought a stuffed bear at a port bazaar for 4 credits on impulse. She had known it the way her grandmother had known it. The way every human who had ever held out something soft to something afraid had known it. You did not need to be the strongest thing in the room. You only needed to be the warmest.